A little bit more. How is everyone doing? Good. Okay, much better, much better, much better. So today, I have the pleasure of talking to you about why I love JSX. And if you're new to React, JSX might seem like, isn't this like PHP all over again? Like why would we use such a thing? But it's very different than something like that. And I'm hoping that this talk is going to show you why the benefits of JSX compared to using strings or some sort of custom templating language. So what is JSX? Just to be very clear of what it is. Well, the definition that Facebook created is that JSX is a XML-like syntax extension for JavaScript. And what that means is a little complicated, but there is a actual specification that Facebook actually put out. Really, this is going to be useful for compiler authors, or if you're extra nerdy and you know Bison grammar and stuff like that, you can check it out. And it basically comes from the perspective completely agnostic of React. It doesn't care, and it doesn't even know about anything about React or even HTML elements. Like JSX itself has nothing to do with that. It's really a very XML-like syntax. And so the most simplest form would be something like this. Here we've got a foo tag, open and closing, simple, very basic. If you've written any HTML or XML, you know what this looks like. So in React, Ben gave a really great introduction. You're going to use JSX in line with your actual JavaScript. It's not in a separate file. It's not inside of a template literal or any kind of string. It's actually in line, and it's a first-class thing in your JavaScript, which means that you're going to have a custom compiler, because obviously this is not JavaScript. But even though this is a React conference, this talk is going to kind of diverge a little bit from React itself, because JSX can be used in other situations. So it's important to keep in mind that JSX is not just for React UI. Now, it's true that that's pretty much what you're going to use it for, like 99% of the times, and some of you 100% of the time. But why I love JSX is really the power that it brings to the JavaScript language itself. So who am I? I'm Jay Phelps, and when I originally was accepted to give this talk and planned this talk, I was actually a software engineer at Netflix, where I worked on developer experience for many years. So it was my job to basically make the lives of other developers better and easier in various ways: tools, insights, frameworks. I was on the RxJS core team. If any of you guys are familiar, or any of you guys or girls are familiar with RxJS. But just very recently, if you follow me on Twitter, you probably already know this, but if you don't, then just recently I actually left Netflix to do a startup with my friend Tracy. And it's called ThisDot. And basically what we do is we do support, training, mentorship, software architecture, developer relations. Basically all that other stuff is what we do. And really we discovered that we know a lot of people in the industry, because we've all been in the industry for a very long time. And we ended up doing a lot of this stuff just for free in our spare time anyway. And so ultimately it was like, well, I really enjoy doing this stuff. I really enjoy helping other people and teaching other people and all that. So why not just do it for a living? So that's what I've started to do. And if any of this is ever interesting to you, if you want to learn more about RxJS, React, even Angular, I know this is a React conference, but we do also specialize in Angular. Just give me a holler. So let's move on with the talk. So JSX XML-like syntax for JavaScript. And you'll notice in that definition, it's very simplistic. Again, it says nothing about React. And that's because JSX itself has no actual defined semantics as a specification. It means nothing other than the fact that it is a expression in JavaScript. But that's not a very useful definition, because we're obviously going to actually use JSX in our code. So in practice, the compilers like Babel and TypeScript are going to treat JSX as if it were a function call expression. So anywhere that you can call a function, you can put JSX. And that's a very critical thing to understand. And when I first started using React, I definitely struggled with this. And I actually have a pretty strong background in compilers and stuff like that. So I understand like the actual grammar and the distinctions between declarations, expressions, and stuff like that, which super helps. But I struggled with this because I was so used to templating languages. So I'm hoping to be able to walk you through so that you can get over that hurdle. So a function call expression. Just so we're totally on the same page, this is a function call expression. So you've got actually this is a variable declaration where the initializer is a function call expression. That create element div, that is the function call expression. With JSX, you could write this exact same thing just like that. So we've got a div, an open tag and a closing tag, and that's it. This is a JSX element, the most simple JSX element in the world. So these two things are entirely equivalent. But because JavaScript itself doesn't actually support JSX, we have to use a custom compiler. And the two most popular are going to be Babel and TypeScript. I would say if you're not already a TypeScript user, I would probably start off with Babel just so you're not trying all new things. Like one of the things with React is it's like Ben was talking about earlier, which is great, is that it doesn't deal with, it doesn't solve all of your problems. It's not like an Ember or an Angular where it's basically like, here's everything. And you may not like everything, and everything may not work for your use case, but it doesn't matter, this is everything, and you're stuck with it. React takes the case of just, here's the bare minimum to get your UI going, and everything else, the community fills in the gaps. And so one of the problems people do, one of the things that people do that I discourage is they get started with React and they overwhelm themselves with everything. They're like, I'm going to use TypeScript. TypeScript so I can use JSX and have typed. I'm going to use Redux Saga or redux-observable, which is a library that I made, so use that one. And they bring on basically everything. They're like CSS and JS, and they're like a custom Webpack and use all sorts of tree shaking, and they basically that's the hashtag JavaScript fatigue. If you're on Twitter, I'm sure you've seen that. So I really discourage that. Like when you first start getting your app, ramp up very slowly. Do the most simplest thing possible. And if that to you feels like don't even use JSX, I think that's certainly okay. In very simple apps, you don't have to use JSX, and it really won't be that bad. There's things you can do to mitigate that. So we want the second one to become the first one after when we use our compiler. So we want Babel, let's say, but we're going to use Babel for the rest of this talk. So let's say Babel, we want Babel to actually transform the first one to the second one. How do we do that? Well, thankfully for everyone in this room, if you're a React person, it'll automatically transform the JSX to React.createElement for you, just by convention, just because it's by far the most popular use case for using JSX. But if you want to, you actually can override that behavior and customize it, because again, JSX is not React specific. To do so, there's a couple different ways, but one of the ways to do so is with a paragma comment. And this is basically just a special comment that Babel and TypeScript both are aware of. When they see this comment, you're basically saying, anytime you see JSX, Mr. Compiler, use some function name as the function that should be called instead of the actual JSX syntax. That's what it should be converted to. So in the example before, we could say, at JSX create element. And now anywhere I use JSX, like in this example with the div, it will get converted to that when you get compiled. And you can actually name it anything you want. It can be any arbitrary function name, and as long as it's actually in scope when the code actually runs in your browser, perfectly fine. So JSX is a function call. And that means that it can be used anywhere that you can put a function call, or any expression really, because a function call, a call expression is the same thing as any other expression as far as where it's legal to be. So let's take a look at a couple examples of that. This might look a little weird at first, but this is totally valid, because basically I'm creating an object literal, and I'm saying, I've got 3 properties, first, second, third, and each one of those values is a JSX element. Now, what is that JSX element? Well, it really depends, right? By default, it will be equivalent to saying React create element, and it would be a virtual DOM node, which we'll learn a little bit more about in future talks. But it doesn't necessarily have to be. It could be other things, and we'll cover that. Another example is going to be like an array. You can call JavaScript functions and pass the results as in an array, right? So of course you can do that. You can create an array of JSX elements. You can also pass JSX elements to functions. So hopefully you're seeing that these are just JavaScript expressions, right? They're just JavaScript expressions. Anything you can do with an expression, you can do that. They really are expressions. But one thing I've actually not seen a lot of people talk about, which to me as a compiler nerd really is an interesting thing and I wanted to point out, is because they are just JavaScript expressions, they can be used in some really, really, really weird places. So let's take a look at that. For these examples, just so that things are a little more terse, let's pretend that we've got the JSX pragma h. So anywhere I use JSX, it will actually get converted to a function call to h. First example we'll look at is this one right here. So we're seeing that I'm taking a foo element and adding it to a bar element, which is weird, especially if you've actually started to do some React. You might be thinking, like, this is really weird. I've never seen anyone do anything like that. So it'd be the equivalent of calling the h function with foo string plus an h function with the bar string. The next example we'll look at is really even more hard to actually grok, especially if you're not used to JSX. Here we've got an object, a JSX element that's called object, and a JSX element called key. And we're using the key JSX element as the actual JavaScript key to look up the property on the result of the object JSX element. Now, if you're confused, don't worry about it, because this actually isn't valid React. Because when you're dealing with React, you're dealing with these virtual elements, and the resulting of one element is going to be a virtual DOM node. And so using that as the key of another object doesn't make any sense at all. But the key of why I'm showing this is because this is perfectly valid JSX. And you can definitely write helpers that would make this run perfectly fine and correct. And so really I'm showing you this so that you really do solidify the idea that JSX is just JavaScript. So those two really weird examples. Now, up until now, we've just shown you very simple, just the tag name stuff. How do I actually get data to it? If I'm using this for like HTML, I want to be able to pass things like the class names and the IDs and other things like that. Well, with JSX, you can pass something that we call props. You will hear some people call them attributes, just because in HTML world, that's what you would call them, as attributes. I like to make the I like to make the distinction between props and attributes, just because attributes to me mean something very specific in the JavaScript world dealing with the HTML DOM. But syntactically, it's very, very, very similar to an HTML attribute. And what that looks like, there's a bunch of different ways. And I'm not going to really dive deep into those different ways because they're really pretty easy to learn about online. But there's the bunch of different ways of passing props, passing these values, these JavaScript expressions, to these JSX elements. You can pass strings just like you would in HTML or XML. You can pass JavaScript expressions using the curly braces around it. And you have Booleans and spreads and stuff like that. So that's what we mean by XML-like. It's not actually XML because only the first syntax would be valid. The rest of them would not. So just like XML and HTML, you can have children, right? And this is, I think, probably one of the more intuitive things, especially if you've ever used any templating language. So if I've got hello J as an element, and I want to actually interpolate J, so I want the word J to be different, to be your name if you're using this app. Well, I can just use curly braces, just like if you're using mustache or pretty much any other templating language. And just like any other templating language, I can then wrap that in bold tags if I wanted to. And so right now, I've got a div element with two different children. The one which is the text hello, comma, with a space after it. And then I've got the bold tag. And inside that bold tag element, it itself has a child of that name attribute, or excuse me, name identifier expression. So hopefully this is, if this is a little confusing, I think after you do just a little bit of actual practical coding, and then you can come back to these slides, and I think it'll make a lot more sense. Another beautiful thing about JSX compared to traditional string interpolation like PHP or something like that is that JSX is going to prevent your standard cross-site scripting attacks because it's not string interpolation. That's almost all cross-site scripting attacks. Not all, but almost all of them rely on the fact that you're interpolating strings, and so they can escape and get out of what you intended. But with JSX, because these are actual first-class JavaScript values, there is none of that. Like it's actually impossible unless you later take the value and do something malicious with it to do some sort of injection with JSX. Again, unless you go out of your way to allow them to do so. So a very simple example is if you take some sort of potentially malicious input. It's from a database or from a third-party, some sort of third-party API where you don't have control over it. There is no problem whatsoever with just being like, I'm going to put that in a div tag. And it doesn't matter if that actual malicious input had, like, for say, a script tag or something in it. Like, that's not going to get actually evaluated as a real script tag. It just would get inserted as actual text. So people would see the script tag as text in the page. It wouldn't actually be a script tag. And this is wonderful. To not have to think about these sort of things just takes a huge burden off the traditional UI architecture. So for some of the examples I'm going to show up next, let's go back to assuming that I've got the JSX pragma of create element. So anytime I use JSX, assume that create element is what is in its place. So if I did create my own, I wanted to create my own concept of a create element, what would that look like? What would I get passed? What values would I get passed to my function? Well, I'd get basically three things. I'd get the tag itself, so either the HTML tag or the component that I want to send or whatever concept I'm using within that JSX. Second argument would be the props. And this is going to be a plain old JavaScript object, or a POJO as it's known, of all the different properties that are set on that JSX object. And we'll see an example here in a sec. And then past the second argument is just going to be a variadic spread of the rest of the children. And if you're not used to like what's variadic spread and what's the ... don't get super hung up on that. But the idea is that the reason why they did it this way instead of just passing an array is because theoretically you could optimize around the fact and not need an extra array allocation because a large majority of your HTML, or excuse me, your JSX elements are only going to have a single child. So creating an extra array for that single child can add up in a very large application. I fundamentally disagree with that choice just because of the developer productivity of creating tooling around this and the inconsistency of that, but totally different talk, so I don't want to get hung up on that. But let's look at an actual concrete example. This is, I wouldn't say this is a tough example, but it's non-trivial. And so don't get super concerned if I lose you. But this is a div where I'm passing in the ID of whatever the value of object.foo is. And I've also got that disabled prop, which will basically mean disable equals true. It's the same thing as shorthand. And then I've got that interpolation of object.bar. This will actually get compiled by Babel to this, create element with these four arguments. The first argument being the tag, the second argument being the object, that POJO of the properties that we're sending to it. And then the rest of the arguments are that variadic number of children. So div, the prop types, and the variadic children. On the variadic children, just to hopefully make that a little more clear, that's that third argument. And if I were to log out, like if I created my own create element and I were to log that value, in that example, that would be an array of text and object.bar. JSX also has some conventions that it's used. It's part of the specification, but this is where it will be very natural to use it, but it's not very natural to try and understand them. Like if you really start to think about it, you're kind of like, that is weird, even though I've been using that. And so let me cover some of those conventions that it uses, which one of them is that any JSX element that starts with a lowercase will get sent to your helper function, your JSX pragma helper function, as a string. An actual string literal. And this is going to be the most common because you're going to have a lot of HTML elements inside of your app. So anytime you do a div or something like that, so here we got a div, that'll get passed as an actual string as the first argument to your helper. That's the most easy to understand. The second one is if the JSX tag actually starts with a uppercase letter, that's the only distinction right now is lowercase versus uppercase. Instead, it will get passed as a JavaScript identifier expression. And this is most common for using like React elements and stuff like that. And what that looks like is if I said like capital foobar, it will get compiled down to create element with the foobar. It'll pass in the actual value of whatever foobar is in that scope. So it's not passing in the string foobar, it's passing in the actual JavaScript expression foobar. Don't get super hung up on that though. So the third convention is very similar to the prior one, and that's if your tag name contains a dot, it will pass that as a JavaScript expression, that dot property lookup expression at runtime. And this is usually used for components, but it doesn't have to be. So if I've got my accordion.section, and it can get compiled down to accordion.section. At runtime, it will pass whatever the value of accordion.section is. Now, in this case, it's probably a React component, but it doesn't have to be. It literally could be a div or a section tag or what have you. And React will render it as an actual HTML element if it was one of those tags. And I've been talking a lot about React and talking about create elements and stuff like that, but JSX is not React UI specific. With creating your presentational components and your containers and stuff like that, let's look at some of the examples of things you can do with JSX that are not specific to that. I'll start off kind of easy, well not easy, but progressing away from React. We're still going to talk about React, but this is an example where I'm going to use a component, a JSX component, that doesn't render anything. It does behavior, but it actually doesn't render any actual HTML elements. This is a project by my friend James called React Request. There's actually a bunch of different similar projects. The idea is basically the same, and the idea behind it is declarative data fetching. So I've got a fetch component that I can say, oh, I want when this component gets rendered, I want you to actually request the resource from this URL. And I'm providing what the community has called a render prop or render callback. And that's a pretty advanced topic, and I don't think it's actually going to get covered today, but it'll probably get covered in the advanced talk. But the idea is just generally when the data comes back, our callback is going to get called, and we can basically render something different. We can render something when the data is not there, like as a pending state, or we can render something when it actually does arrive. And this is entirely in a declarative fashion, which is this is actually very different than what you'll probably do when you first start using React. You'll probably do things a little bit more imperatively. You'll component did mount. Inside component did mount, you'll call your AJAX request, and then you'll call set state, which will cause the re-render. This is essentially the same thing, just in a more declarative fashion. A more complex example, I'm not going to talk too much about, but here it lets you detect whether you're fetching right now or not and stuff like that. Moving away from React entirely. Remember, I said it's not React specific. There's a project called JSX Object. Actually, you'll discover saying JSX repeatedly is a very hard thing to say. It's a tongue twister. But JSX Object is an interesting project to let you use JSX as a representation for JSON, essentially. So if I've got Webpack, if any of you have used Webpack, you always have to have your Webpack configuration. You could use JSX to do this. This is a little getting more controversial. Some people are very like, this is XML all over again. But it's really different because not only is it just the ability to have that XML syntax, like show the parent-child relationship, which XML is actually a lot better at than JSON is. It allows you to use actual JavaScript, so you could do conditionals. You could use a different Webpack config variable if you're on production build or not. So it's a very powerful thing. This will actually get converted using that JSX object to this JSON on the right, which is the more traditional Webpack configuration if you've ever made one of those. So I encourage you to experiment with these type of things. Like the React itself took many years to gain traction because of how controversial these things seemed at first. People were sitting in their chairs during JSConf and hearing the announcement, and they're just like, this goes against everything I've ever heard. And I am one of those people. I bashed React for many years and was just like, no way, this is PHP all over again. And it's simply because I just didn't give it a chance. I actually was using PHP at the time, so I had a very bad experience. But it's very, very different because it's syntax. It's actual part of the language itself. The next question that I had, at least, and I hear this a lot from the community, is why didn't they just use ES6 template literals? Particularly because at the time it was a proposal and they knew about it and they could have used it, but they chose not to. This one is a little, up to interpretation, but let's look at an example. What if they would have done that? What would it have looked like? Well, here's a actually fairly simple example. You'll see something like this in React all the time. But this is using template literals, if such a syntax existed. And syntax highlighting goes a long way to help this be readable, but template literals really just have a lot of noise. If you're needing to interpolate inside of an interpolated string, like things just get really confusing and hard to keep track of. And a little bit of syntax reduction goes a really long way when you're doing that stuff. So let's compare the template literal version to the JSX version, like if you were doing this in React. And I think everyone here could probably agree, like even if you don't like React, which I don't know why you're here if you don't, but the latter is just significantly more readable. Like even if I stripped away the syntax highlighting, it would be a lot easier to deal with. And not only that, is that the template literal syntax, there's one major thing that it does not give you, which is compile time validation of your actual HTML elements. Like this potentially at runtime could be completely invalid JSX or whatever it would be. I could accidentally have 2 opening tags or 2 closing tags, and at a normal compile time, traditional compile time, it would not tell me that. Now, theoretically, you could create extra tooling around to try and solve that, but JSX, because it's so first class, it doesn't need to jump through all those hoops. If it compiles down to your function calls, you know it's going to be valid. Now, how is this then different from a templating language? Who here is actually, when I say templating language, I mean something like Mustache, or Ember, or Angular, or Vue, or Backbone. All of these languages have, all these previous UI stuff traditionally uses templating languages. And just so for my reference, who here has used a templating language before? Okay, so nearly everyone, but not everyone, and that's pretty expected. I assume most people used it, but not everyone. So how is this really fundamentally different? Well, besides the things that I've talked about, if it hasn't become obvious, the biggest reason it's different is because you get to utilize your existing JavaScript abilities. And not just existing ones, but build your ones. I can guarantee you that after a couple years of React, you will become a significantly better JavaScript programmer. Not even just React itself. Let's say, like, as things go, React will probably go the way of the dodo within a decade, because that's just as things go in the JavaScript community. But the skills you learn from this are easily transferable and normal. So especially things like functional programming. So let's take a look at an example of what I mean by that. If I've got an array of items, I've got 1, 2, 3, and I want to actually output an ordered list in HTML, that would, the result is what I'm looking for is something like that. And if I use something like Mustache, which is probably like the old, one of the, not the oldest, but it's well over 10 years old, it looks like this. And this is pretty easy to understand once you learn the syntax, and so it's not the end of the world. But you'd have to learn that syntax, and what you learned is domain specific. Mustache is the only language that looks like this. You're never going, if you stopped using Mustache, that knowledge was useless knowledge. You're never going to use that knowledge again. Whereas with React, with JSX, this is the equivalent. And inside of those curly braces, that's just a JavaScript expression. So you're using normal functional programming. So in this case, we've got the array, and I'm using the map. And if you're not familiar with map, map is built into JavaScript. This is not special. And to really drive that home, there's a phrase that the React community uses that sometimes gets used tongue-in-cheek because some of the other communities dislike us saying it. But we usually say that JSX is just JavaScript. It's just JavaScript. And while that's bending the truth a little bit because you have to use a compiler on top of that, you could say it's just syntactic sugar for JavaScript as one way of saying it. And there really is the major distinction and benefit, in my eyes, of JSX. So you can do anything that you could do with JavaScript. Here in this case, I'm not interpolating it directly. I'm creating an intermediate variable. And then I'm going to pass that intermediate variable to a do something function. And the result of that will actually get provided as the children of the unordered list. So anything you can do with JavaScript, you can do with JSX. And that's wonderful because so many times in previous things, particularly with the last two frameworks I used, which were Ember and Sprout Core before that, I would always be fighting the templating language. I would find the edges, right? I would find the places where, like, because I'd work on complex apps, and I would find places where it's just like the language wasn't designed for this, and so I have to basically do a whole bunch of bike shedding about, like, can we add the syntax feature to the language itself? Or I would need to expose some sort of custom helper, like have a bunch of boilerplate so that I can expose that. With JSX, none of that is true. It's just JavaScript. So you can just call functions and compose functions and anything you would normally do with JavaScript. And that's really just one of the most wonderful things about it. And I think that as I wrap up this talk, I think that if you have not already fallen in love with it, I think you really will fall in love with JSX. And even though some of the other frameworks, like I have a lot of respect for Angular and also Ember as well, and they're doing some things that I think are much better than React, but fundamentally I have a really hard time letting go of JSX. Now I feel just completely spoiled, and it's all I want to use. I don't want to learn another templating language. So I would highly encourage you and your team, as you get more progress into React and get more familiar with it, to experiment with JSX. Break some of the quote-unquote rules of what we say. Create the next thing using JSX. I'm really a huge proponent of the declarative style of fetching and data resources and stuff like that, and connecting with your GraphQL and all that stuff. There's a lot of really great innovation in the community that has yet to completely solidify. So if I had to summarize my talk, it's that I would say that I love JSX because it's just JavaScript. And hopefully you don't blast me on Twitter for saying that, but I really think that after the end of the day, if you have not already fallen in love with it, that you really will. So if you have any questions, I will be available after here, and I'll be out there, and you're welcome to come talk to me, or I'll be available at lunch as well, and we're happy to talk. You can also follow me on Twitter at _JPhelps. The regular J Phelps is like a 17-year-old kid who tweets basketball stuff. So I only mention that because literally, like, every couple months I take a look at his followers, and like a huge chunk of them are actually people who meant to follow me. And it's just, I think it's funny that they think that I'm tweeting a bunch of basketball stuff, because I know nothing about basketball. Like, I really don't. Like, I'm like, I don't know. So yeah. So if you have any questions, just come see me. Thank you for all your time.